Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to a time when survival wasn't guaranteed, comfort was a distant dream, and your biggest worry wasn't Wi-Fi dropping out. It was literally dropping dead from 100 different medieval miseries. The heavy wooden door to your hut groans open, releasing a cloud of acrid smoke that makes your eyes water instantly. You stumble forward, bare feet hitting the frozen dirt floor, and already you can hear the sounds of Novgorod waking up around you. The clatter of wooden buckets, the angry bleating of goats, and somewhere in the distance, the deep, ominous toll of church bells that seems to vibrate through your very bones. If you're into this kind of soft-spoken time travel, tap like and hit subscribe. It's free, and you're never stuck with it. Also, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and how your day went. I love hearing from you night owls around the world. So settle in, get comfortable, and let me paint you a picture of medieval Russia that might just make you grateful for your heated bedroom and clean sheets. Let's step into the smoky dawn of the 13th century together. You're jarring awake not to the gentle chime of an alarm, but to the acrid bite of smoke filling your lungs. The fire that kept you from freezing to death during the night has been smoldering in the center of your one-room hut, and now it's producing more smoke than warmth. Your eyes stream as you sit up on what passes for a bed, basically a pile of straw covered with whatever animal skins you've managed to scrape together. The smoke has nowhere to go except through a hole in the roof, assuming it hasn't been blocked by snow, which it probably has. The walls around you are made of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, and despite your best efforts, cold air seeps through every gap. Your breath comes out in visible puffs, and you can already feel the familiar ache in your joints that comes from sleeping on an unforgiving surface in sub-zero temperatures. This isn't camping. This is just Tuesday in medieval Novgorod. You swing your legs over the side of your makeshift bed, and your bare feet hit the dirt floor with a shock that travels straight up your spine. The ground is hard as stone, frozen solid and covered with a thin layer of ash from the fire pit. Somewhere in the darkness, you can hear the rustle of small creatures, mice, probably, or maybe rats, going about their own morning routines, which likely involve eating whatever crumbs you might have dropped. As you stand, your back protests with a series of pops and creaks that would make a chiropractor weep. Medieval furniture wasn't exactly designed with ergonomics in mind, and your spine has been slowly but surely reshaping itself to match the contours of whatever hard surfaces you've been sleeping on. You're probably 25 years old, but you feel like you're 60, and honestly, you're not entirely sure you'll make it to 30 at this rate. The smoke is getting thicker now, and you realize you need to do something about the fire before you asphyxiate in your own home. You grab a long stick, your medieval fire poker, and start prodding at the smoldering logs, trying to either get them burning properly or put them out entirely. Each poke sends up a fresh cloud of smoke that makes you cough violently, and you're starting to understand why medieval people had such short life expectancies. Outside, you can hear the sounds of your neighbors going through their own morning routines, which sound suspiciously similar to yours. Lots of coughing, some creative medieval swearing, and the occasional crash of something wooden hitting something else wooden. The sun hasn't fully risen yet, but that's never stopped medieval people from getting an early start on their daily struggle for survival. You manage to coax a small flame from the dying embers, and immediately the hut fills with even more smoke. It's a catch-22 of medieval proportions. You need the fire for warmth, but the fire is slowly poisoning you with its fumes. Historians still argue whether medieval people developed some kind of immunity to smoke inhalation, or if they just accepted lung damage as part of the package deal of not freezing to death. The mainstream historical fact here is that medieval Russian homes were typically heated by a central fire pit with a hole in the roof for ventilation, a system that was both inefficient and dangerous. But here's a quirky tidbit that might surprise you. Archaeologists have found evidence that some medieval Russian families kept small animals like chickens or even young pigs inside their homes during winter, not just for warmth, but because the animals' body heat actually contributed significantly to keeping the space livable. As you stand there in the smoke-filled gloom, trying to decide whether hypothermia or carbon monoxide poisoning is the better way to go, you start to hear voices outside getting louder and more urgent. Someone is shouting something about the market, and you catch the word bread being passed from hut to hut like the world's most depressing game of telephone. Your stomach chooses this moment to remind you that you haven't eaten since yesterday's disappointment of a meal, and suddenly the smoke seems like the least of your problems. You're going to have to venture out into the frozen hellscape of medieval Novgorod and try to find something edible, which means dealing with the market, the merchants, and the ever-present possibility that whatever food you do find might actually make you sicker than starving. You pull on your outer garments, layers of rough wool and fur that smell like they've been marinating in wood smoke and animal musk for months, which they have, and prepare to face whatever fresh medieval misery awaits you outside. The door creaks ominously as you lift the heavy wooden bar that serves as your lock, and as it swings open, a blast of frigid air hits you like a physical force. Welcome to medieval Russia. Try not to die before breakfast. You step outside and immediately wish you hadn't. The air hits your face like a slap from an angry ice giant, and your lungs seize up as you try to breathe the kind of cold that makes your teeth ache. But worse than the temperature is the smell that assaults your nostrils, a cocktail of human waste, rotting food scraps, animal droppings, and something unidentifiable that might charitably be called essence of medieval despair. The market square stretches before you, a chaotic maze of wooden stalls and makeshift booths where vendors are already hawking their questionable wares despite the early hour. Your stomach growls again, reminding you why you're here, but as you take your first tentative steps toward the nearest bread stall, you start to question whether starvation might actually be the preferable option. The bread vendor, a gap-toothed woman whose age is impossible to determine because medieval living has weathered her face like old leather, holds up what she optimistically calls a loaf. It's roughly the size and texture of a small brick with a crust so hard you could probably use it as a weapon. The color is somewhere between mud brown and suspiciously green, and when she taps it against her wooden counter, it makes a sound like knocking on a door. "Fresh bread," she croaks, though you're pretty sure this particular loaf was fresh sometime during the previous century. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval Russian bread was typically made from rye, which was hardier than wheat in the harsh climate, but often the grain was mixed with whatever else was available: barley, oats, or in desperate times ground acorns and tree bark. You point at the bread brick and ask the price, though you're already dreading the answer. She holds up 3 fingers and says something about kopecks that makes your heart sink. That's half your weekly earnings, assuming you can find work, which is never guaranteed. But here's the thing about medieval economics. When you're starving, even overpriced bread starts to look like a reasonable investment in not dying. You're about to hand over your precious coins when you notice something moving in the loaf. At first you think it's your imagination, but then you see it again, a small, dark shape scuttling across the crust. The bread is inhabited. The vendor notices your hesitation and waves dismissively, as if bug-infested baked goods are just another charming feature of medieval cuisine. "Extra protein," she says with a grin that reveals more gaps than teeth, and you realize she's not entirely wrong. Historians still argue whether medieval people were genuinely unaware of food hygiene, or if they simply had no choice but to accept that their meals came with bonus insects. But either way, you're facing a difficult decision. You look around desperately for alternatives and spot another vendor selling what he claims is porridge. It's a gray, lumpy substance that moves with a consistency somewhere between oatmeal and wet concrete. When you ask what's in it, he launches into an enthusiastic description that includes barley, water, and something he calls whatever else was lying around. The smell rising from his pot suggests that whatever else might include things that were better left unidentified. Next to the porridge vendor is a woman selling dried fish that look like they've been mummified by accident. They're so desiccated that they practically crumble when she picks them up, and the smell is reminiscent of low tide mixed with old socks. She assures you they're very nutritious, which in medieval terms usually means probably won't kill you immediately. You're starting to understand why medieval people were generally shorter and thinner than modern humans, not by choice, but because finding edible food was like playing Russian roulette with your digestive system. Every meal was a gamble, and the house always seemed to have the advantage. A quirky historical tidbit that might make you feel better about your situation. Medieval Russians sometimes ate a dish called tyuria, which was essentially stale bread soaked in kvass, a mildly alcoholic beverage made from fermented bread. It was basically liquid bread soup. And while it sounds awful, it was actually a clever way to make rock-hard bread edible while getting a small alcohol buzz to help forget how terrible everything tasted. You're still contemplating your limited options when a commotion breaks out near the fish stall. Two customers are arguing loudly about the quality of some particularly questionable-looking herring, and their dispute is attracting a crowd. Medieval markets were social hubs as much as commercial centers, and any entertainment, even an argument about rotten fish, was worth stopping to watch. The argument escalates when one of the customers accuses the fish seller of trying to pass off last month's catch as this week's haul. The seller responds by waving one of the suspect fish in the air like a weapon, which causes several scales to fall off and scatter across the muddy ground. The crowd murmurs appreciatively. This is quality entertainment by medieval standards. You use the distraction to sidle closer to the bread stall, hoping maybe the vendor will be so absorbed in the fish drama that she'll forget to charge you full price. But she's watching you like a hawk, one weathered hand protectively hovering over her collection of brick-like loaves. Medieval merchants didn't survive by being generous or inattentive. The cold is starting to seep through your layers of clothing, and your feet are going numb in your thin leather shoes. The ground beneath the market stalls is a mixture of mud, animal droppings, and food scraps that have been trampled into a slippery, treacherous mess. You have to watch every step to avoid slipping or stepping in something that will make your day even worse than it already is. Finally, you make your decision. You hand over your coins to the bread vendor and accept the insect-inhabited loaf, figuring that at least the bugs prove there's some protein in there somewhere. She wraps it in a piece of cloth that's seen better days, probably better years, and wishes you good health with the kind of smirk that suggests she knows you're going to need all the luck you can get. As you clutch your expensive, questionable breakfast and prepare to navigate your way back through the reeking market square, you can't help but think that maybe those medieval people who became monks and lived on nothing but prayer and cabbage soup might have had the right idea after all. You trudge back through the market with your questionable breakfast tucked under one arm, already dreading the next item on your medieval survival agenda, getting clean. Well, clean is probably too generous a term for what passes as hygiene in 13th century Novgorod, but your body is starting to emit smells that would make even your neighbor's livestock uncomfortable, and that's saying something in a world where personal fragrance standards are remarkably low. The communal bathhouse sits at the edge of town, a low wooden structure that looks like it was built by someone who had heard about architecture but never actually seen it practiced. Smoke rises from its roof, which should be encouraging. It means the fires are lit and the water is theoretically warm, but the sounds coming from inside suggest that whatever's happening in there involves more screaming than you'd expect from a relaxing wash. You push open the heavy wooden door and immediately regret every life choice that led you to this moment. The air inside is thick with steam, but it's not the pleasant, spa-like atmosphere you might imagine. Instead, it's a choking fog that smells like a combination of wet wool, unwashed bodies, and something that might charitably be called eau de medieval desperation. The mainstream historical fact about Russian bathhouses, or banyas, is that they were actually quite advanced for their time, using a system of heated stones and water to create steam. Russians took bathing seriously, often using birch branches to stimulate circulation, a practice that continues today. But here's where the medieval reality diverges sharply from the historical romance novels. The first thing that hits you, after the smell, is the noise. Medieval bathing was apparently a communal activity that involved a lot of splashing, shouting, and what sounds suspiciously like someone being murdered in the corner. You quickly realize that the screaming is actually just the sound of people reacting to water temperatures that fluctuate wildly between Arctic and surface of the sun, with no middle ground. The bathhouse is divided into sections, though divided is a generous term for what amounts to wooden planks that provide the illusion of privacy while actually concealing nothing. Men and women bathe separately, which is probably for the best given that medieval underwear wasn't exactly designed for modesty. You make your way toward the men's section, stepping carefully on wooden planks that are slippery with soap, water, and substances you prefer not to identify. A quirky historical tidbit that might surprise you. Medieval Russians believed that the hotter the bathhouse, the more purifying it was for both body and soul. Some people would stay in temperatures that would make modern saunas seem like gentle spring afternoons, believing that sweating out toxins was both physically and spiritually cleansing. Unfortunately, this occasionally resulted in people literally passing out from heat exhaustion, which rather defeated the purpose of getting clean. You find an empty spot on a wooden bench that's wet with what you hope is just water, and begin the arduous process of removing your layers of medieval clothing. Each garment comes off like an archaeological excavation, revealing new levels of dirt, smell, and fabric deterioration. Your undershirt, a generous term for what amounts to a sack with armholes, has achieved a color that doesn't exist in nature and a texture that suggests it might actually be more dirt than fabric at this point. The water situation is where things get really interesting. There's no running water, obviously, so bathing involves a series of wooden buckets filled with water of varying temperatures and questionable origins. Some buckets contain water that's been heated over the fire and is now roughly the temperature of molten lava. Others contain water that appears to have been drawn directly from the frozen river and might actually contain small ice crystals. Your bathing companions, a motley collection of peasants, craftsmen, and the occasional merchant, are all going through the same ritual of trying to find water that won't either freeze or scald them. The man next to you tests his bucket by dipping one finger and immediately jerking it back with a yelp that echoes through the steamy chamber. Medieval bathing was clearly more of an extreme sport than a hygiene practice. You finally locate a bucket of water that seems to be at a temperature that won't cause permanent injury and begin the process of actually washing. The soap, and you use that term very loosely, is a grayish lump that looks like it was carved from a larger rock. It produces virtually no lather and has the cleaning power of rubbing yourself with a mildly abrasive stone, which, come to think of it, might actually be what it is. Historians still argue whether medieval soap was actually effective at removing dirt, or if people just convinced themselves they were cleaner because they had performed the ritual of bathing. Based on your current experience, you're leaning toward the latter theory. You're scrubbing vigorously with the soap rock, but instead of feeling cleaner, you mostly feel like you're redistributing the dirt into new and more creative patterns across your skin. The birch branches that are supposed to stimulate your circulation are hanging from hooks around the bathhouse, and you watch in fascination as other bathers whip themselves with them, like they're performing some kind of medieval penance. When you try it yourself, you discover that stimulating circulation is a euphemism for inflicting deliberate pain on yourself while naked and wet, which seems to perfectly capture the medieval approach to self-care. The water you're using quickly turns an alarming shade of brown, and you realize that you might actually be marinating in a soup of your own filth, mixed with the accumulated grime of everyone who used this bucket before you. Medieval water recycling was apparently more about conservation than sanitation, and you're starting to understand why people seem to get sick so often despite their best efforts at cleanliness. By the time you finish your bath, you're not entirely sure you're any cleaner than when you started, but you're definitely wetter, colder, and more aware of exactly how much dirt the human body can accumulate. You put your clothes back on, the same clothes you were wearing before, because clean clothes are apparently even more of a luxury than clean water, and they immediately begin absorbing the moisture from your skin, creating a clammy, uncomfortable sensation that will probably last for hours. As you prepare to leave the bathhouse, shivering and vaguely damp, you can't help but think that maybe medieval people's short life expectancy had less to do with disease and warfare and more to do with the daily trauma of trying to maintain basic hygiene in a world that seemed actively hostile to the concept of being clean. You step out of the bathhouse feeling marginally less filthy, but significantly more miserable, water still dripping from your hair and creating icy rivulets down your back. The morning air hits your damp skin like a physical assault, and you're starting to think that maybe staying dirty wasn't such a bad option after all. But before you can even begin to process the trauma of medieval hygiene, you hear the sound that makes every peasant's blood run cold, the rhythmic clatter of hoofbeats on frozen ground, accompanied by the distinctive jingle of mail armor. The Mongol tax collectors have arrived in Novgorod, and they're making their presence known with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer to the face. These aren't your friendly neighborhood revenue agents coming by for a polite chat about your financial obligations. These are ironclad emissaries of the Golden Horde, and they have a business model that makes modern debt collectors look like gentle school counselors. You duck behind the corner of the bathhouse, still dripping wet and now shivering uncontrollably as the small procession rides into the town square. There are maybe 6 of them, but they might as well be 60 for all the terror they inspire. Their horses are massive, battle-tested beasts that seem to steam in the cold air, and their riders sit in their saddles with the casual confidence of people who know that resistance is not just futile, it's suicidal. The mainstream historical fact here is that the Mongol Empire established a sophisticated taxation system across their conquered territories, including the Russian principalities. Local rulers were required to collect tribute and deliver it to Mongol officials, creating a bureaucracy of fear that was remarkably efficient. But here's where the medieval reality gets particularly unpleasant for people like you. The lead tax collector, a man whose face looks like it was carved from granite by someone who is angry about having to do the carving, dismounts and begins barking orders in a mixture of Mongol and broken Russian. His message is simple and terrifying. Everyone owes taxes, payment is due immediately, and the consequences of non-payment will be personally demonstrated on anyone foolish enough to test their patience. A quirky historical tidbit that might interest you if you weren't currently fearing for your life. Mongol tax collectors often carried silk scarves as a badge of office because silk was considered so valuable that counterfeiting it was nearly impossible. The irony of delicate silk representing the iron fist of imperial taxation probably wasn't lost on anyone, though pointing this out to the collectors would have been a spectacularly bad idea. The townspeople are emerging from their homes and shops like reluctant participants in a nightmare parade, each clutching whatever coins, goods, or valuables they've managed to scrape together. You watch a baker stumble forward with a handful of copper coins that probably represent his entire week's earnings, only to have the tax collector weigh them in his palm and shake his head dismissively. Not enough. What happens next is a masterclass in medieval debt collection. The collector doesn't raise his voice or make threats. He simply nods to one of his companions, who dismounts and walks over to the baker's stall. With casual efficiency, he begins loading bread, flour, and anything else of value into saddlebags. The baker protests weakly, pointing to his family, his children, his need to eat, but the collectors have heard it all before. They're not interested in sob stories, they're interested in tribute. You realize with growing horror that you're next. You have exactly 3 copper coins left after your breakfast purchase, and based on what you're witnessing, that's not going to be nearly enough to satisfy the Golden Horde's revenue requirements. Your mind races through possible escape routes, but the collectors have positioned themselves strategically around the square. This isn't their first tax collection, and they've learned to cover all the exits. Historians still argue whether the Mongol taxation system was more or less oppressive than other medieval revenue collection methods. But from your current perspective, hiding behind a bathhouse while armed men confiscate your neighbors' livelihoods, the academic debate seems somewhat irrelevant. The collector's methods are certainly effective. Everyone pays one way or another. A young woman approaches the collectors with a baby in her arms, obviously hoping that motherhood might inspire some mercy. She offers them a small silver pendant, probably a family heirloom, maybe her only valuable possession. The lead collector examines it briefly, bites it to test its purity, and then pockets it. But instead of moving on, he holds out his hand expectantly. The pendant was just the opening bid, not the final payment. The woman begins to weep, explaining in broken Russian mixed with local dialect that she has nothing else, that her husband died in the last war, that the baby needs food. The collector listens with the patience of someone who has heard identical pleas in dozens of conquered towns. When she finishes, he simply points to her winter cloak, a thick, fur-lined garment that's probably the only thing keeping her and her baby from freezing to death. This is where you discover that Mongol tax collection operates on a sliding scale of desperation. If you can't pay in coins, they'll take goods. If you can't pay in goods, they'll take tools, furniture, or clothing. If you can't pay in possessions, they'll take family members as slaves. And if you can't pay at all, well, they'll take you as an example to encourage future compliance from your neighbors. You're still trying to figure out how to avoid this entire nightmare when you hear your name being called. Somehow, impossibly, they know you're here. Maybe someone saw you duck behind the bathhouse, or maybe they're just systematically checking every hiding place in town. Either way, your brief career as a fugitive from Mongol taxation is about to come to an embarrassing end. You step out from behind the bathhouse, still damp and shivering, trying to project an air of cooperative innocence while simultaneously calculating whether you can outrun a war horse. The lead collector looks you up and down with the expression of someone evaluating livestock, taking in your wet hair, your worn clothing, and your obvious poverty with professional assessment. He holds out his hand, and you place your 3 remaining copper coins in his palm. He weighs them, examines them, and then makes a sound somewhere between a laugh and a snort. 3 copper coins, apparently, are what the Golden Horde considers a down payment on your continued existence. The real negotiation is just beginning, and you're starting to realize that your morning bath might have been your last act as a free person. The collector begins pointing at your possessions, your shoes, your cloak, the knife at your belt, with the systematic thoroughness of someone conducting an inventory. In Mongol mathematics, everything you own is potentially taxable, and the exchange rate is whatever they decide it is at any given moment. You hand over your knife, a pathetic excuse for a blade that couldn't cut through warm butter, but apparently valuable enough to satisfy the Mongol appetite for confiscation, and watch as the tax collector tucks it into his belt with the casual air of someone adding another trophy to his collection. Your shoes, thankfully, are deemed too worn and worthless to bother with, which is probably the first piece of good luck you've had since waking up in your smoke-filled hut. The collectors mount their horses and ride out of town with their haul of extracted misery, leaving behind a square full of people who are suddenly much poorer and significantly more motivated to avoid imperial attention in the future. You're left standing there, shoeless in the frozen mud, contemplating the fact that your net worth has just been reduced to whatever lint might be hiding in your pockets. But medieval survival doesn't pause for financial trauma, and you still need firewood if you want to avoid freezing to death tonight. The forest outside Novgorod beckons with its promise of burnable wood, and its equally compelling promise of violent death at the hands of wolves, bandits, or worse. You gather up your courage, what's left of your dignity, and a rope for bundling wood, then set off toward the tree line like a condemned man walking to his execution. The path into the forest is well worn by generations of desperate peasants on similar missions, but that doesn't make it safe. It just means that if something terrible happens to you, at least you'll have plenty of company in the afterlife. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval Russian forests were genuinely dangerous places, home to large populations of wolves, bears, and human predators who found the wilderness an ideal place to conduct business away from the inconvenience of law enforcement. You're maybe 20 minutes into the woods, following a trail that seems to disappear and reappear at random intervals when you hear the first howl. It's distant, maybe a mile away, but it carries through the cold air with crystal clarity. Wolves in medieval Russia weren't the shy, ecologically balanced creatures that modern wildlife documentaries make them out to be. These were desperate, hungry predators in a landscape that offered precious little easy prey, and a lone human gathering firewood was basically a walking dinner invitation. The howl is answered by another, then another, and you realize with growing alarm that you're listening to pack communication. Medieval wolves hunted in coordinated groups that would make modern military strategists jealous, and they had a success rate that suggested they were very, very good at their job. You pick up your pace, trying to project confidence while simultaneously scanning the underbrush for glowing eyes and calculating your chances of making it back to town before becoming a cautionary tale. Here's a quirky historical tidbit that probably won't help your current situation, but might be interesting if you survive. Medieval Russian folklore was full of stories about werewolves and shapeshifters, which modern historians believe might have been cultural memories of particularly clever or persistent wolf attacks. When wolves learn to open gates, work together to isolate prey, or seem to anticipate human behavior, people assume they must be something more than ordinary animals. You're so focused on listening for wolf sounds that you almost miss the distinctly human rustling in the bushes ahead. Almost. The footsteps are trying to be quiet, but whoever is making them has apparently never mastered the art of stealth. Branches snap, leaves crackle, and someone mutters what sounds suspiciously like medieval profanity when they step on something sharp. Highway robbery in medieval Russia was a thriving industry, partly because the roads were isolated and poorly patrolled, but mostly because desperate times made desperate people out of otherwise reasonable citizens. The bandits who emerge from the undergrowth look like they've been living rough for months. Their clothes are torn and filthy, their hair is matted, and they smell like they've been marinating in their own desperation. There are 3 of them, armed with an assortment of weapons that look like they were assembled from whatever they could steal, find, or improvise. One has a proper sword, though it's rusty and chipped. Another carries a long knife that might once have been a kitchen implement. The third is holding what appears to be a farming tool that's been sharpened to a point, creating a medieval improvised weapon that looks like it would be more dangerous to its wielder than to its intended victim. The lead bandit, distinguishable from his companions, mainly by having slightly fewer visible wounds and marginally better teeth, steps forward and delivers what is apparently the standard medieval robbery greeting, your money or your life. It's not particularly original, but it gets the point across with admirable efficiency. You explain, with what you hope is convincing sincerity, that you've recently been visited by Mongol tax collectors and are currently in possession of exactly 0 money, no valuables, and barely enough clothing to maintain basic modesty. The bandits exchange glances, clearly disappointed by your poverty but not entirely convinced of your honesty. This is where medieval economics gets really interesting. Even when you have nothing, people assume you must be hiding something, because the alternative, that you're genuinely as destitute as you appear, is too depressing for anyone to accept. The bandits begin a thorough search of your person, patting down your clothes and checking your shoes for hidden coins with the thoroughness of customs agents. Historians still argue whether medieval highway robbery was primarily about desperation or opportunity, but from your current perspective, the academic distinction seems less important than the very immediate problem of convincing 3 armed strangers that you're too poor to rob. Unfortunately, your recent encounter with the tax collectors has left you in the awkward position of being both genuinely impoverished and suspiciously eager to prove it. The search reveals nothing except some interesting holes in your clothing and the fact that you really need to do laundry more often. The bandits huddle together for a quick consultation, probably trying to decide whether it's worth the effort to murder someone who's clearly not going to provide any financial return on their investment. While they're debating your fate, you notice that the wolf howls are getting closer, and now there are more of them. A lot more. The forest around you is starting to sound like it's hosting some kind of predator convention, and you're beginning to suspect that your little robbery encounter might be interrupted by something with bigger teeth and less interest in negotiation. The bandits notice it too. Medieval criminals might have been desperate, but they weren't stupid, and they knew that wolves didn't discriminate between law-abiding citizens and highway robbers when it came to dinner time. One of them glances nervously at the tree line, then back at you, then at his companions, clearly trying to calculate whether they have time to finish robbing you before becoming wolf food themselves. This is when you realize that medieval survival often came down to a simple question: which threat is more immediate? The humans with weapons who want your non-existent money, or the wolves with teeth who want your actual flesh? It's not the kind of multiple choice question they prepare you for in any reasonable education system. The wolves make the decision for everyone. A long, bone-chilling howl echoes from maybe 50 yards away, close enough that you can practically feel the vibrations in your chest, and suddenly your little robbery drama transforms into an unexpected alliance of mutual survival. The bandits look at each other, look at you, look at the darkening forest around you, and apparently decide that whatever coins you might be hiding aren't worth becoming a medieval wolf buffet. "Run," says the lead bandit, and for once in this entire miserable day, someone is giving you advice that makes perfect sense. You don't need to be told twice. You abandon any pretense of dignity and bolt toward town like your life depends on it, which it absolutely does, with 3 former highway robbers running alongside you in what has to be the most awkward evacuation party in medieval history. Behind you, the forest erupts in a chorus of howls that sounds like something from your worst nightmares, except you're awake and running and starting to realize that maybe gathering firewood wasn't worth risking becoming a cautionary tale about why peasants should stay inside after dark. The wolves are closing in, and you can hear branches snapping and leaves rustling as something large moves through the underbrush with the kind of fluid coordination that suggests they've done this before. You burst out of the forest and into the outskirts of Novgorod just as the first wolf appears at the tree line. a massive gray shape with eyes that reflect the dim afternoon light like yellow coins. It watches you for a moment, probably calculating whether chasing you into town is worth the effort, then melts back into the shadows with the kind of predatory patience that suggests it knows you'll be back eventually. The bandits scatter without a word, disappearing into the maze of huts and alleys with a practiced efficiency. Your brief partnership of mutual terror is over, and you're left standing at the edge of town, empty-handed, out of breath, and forced to confront the reality that you still need firewood, but now have vivid, personal experience with exactly why nobody wants to go get it. This is where medieval justice comes into play, because apparently your day hasn't been educational enough yet. As you're standing there trying to figure out how to heat your hut without venturing back into wolf territory, you notice a crowd gathering in the town square around what appears to be some kind of official proceeding. Medieval entertainment options were limited, so any kind of public spectacle drew audiences like moths to a flame. The village court is in session, presided over by a local boyar who has the kind of face that suggests he's never met a problem he couldn't solve with violence or the threat thereof. He's hearing a case involving a dispute between two neighbors over a boundary line that's apparently shifted during the recent thaw, and both parties are presenting their arguments with the kind of passionate intensity usually reserved for matters of life and death. The mainstream historical fact here is that medieval Russian justice operated on a combination of customary law, princely decrees, and local tradition, with punishments that were designed more for public deterrence than individual rehabilitation. But here's where things get particularly medieval. The court doesn't have time for lengthy deliberations or complex legal reasoning. Justice needs to be swift, visible, and memorable. The boyar listens to both sides of the boundary dispute with the patience of someone who has heard identical arguments 1,000 times before, then renders his verdict with the kind of finality that suggests appeals are not part of the judicial process. The defendant, a scraggly peasant who looks like he hasn't had a good meal in months, is found guilty of moving the boundary stones and sentenced to 20 lashes in the public square. A quirky historical tidbit that might surprise you. Medieval Russian courts sometimes used trial by ordeal to determine guilt or innocence, including tests like walking on hot coals or plunging hands into boiling water. The theory was that divine intervention would protect the innocent, though in practice it mostly just provided entertainment for spectators and permanent disability for participants. The flogging begins immediately because medieval justice doesn't believe in delays or appeals. The executioner, a burly man who clearly takes professional pride in his work, strips the condemned man to the waist and ties him to a wooden post that's been worn smooth by previous use. The first blow of the whip makes a sound like a thunderclap, and the victim's scream echoes through the square with crystal clarity. You watch in fascination and horror as justice is administered with mechanical precision. Each lash is carefully measured and delivered with the kind of professional competence that comes from years of practice. The crowd counts along, 7, 8, 9, with the enthusiasm of people attending a sporting event rather than a judicial proceeding. By the 15th lash, the condemned man has stopped screaming and is hanging limply from his bonds, probably unconscious from pain or shock or both. The executioner pauses to check his pulse, professional courtesy apparently, then continues with the remaining 5 strokes. Medieval justice believes in completing the full sentence even if the recipient is no longer conscious to appreciate it. Historians still argue whether medieval punishments were genuinely effective deterrents or just public entertainment disguised as law enforcement, but from your position in the crowd, watching a man's back turn into hamburger over a property dispute, the distinction seems academic. The message is clear. Don't mess with boundary stones, don't challenge the boyar's decisions, and definitely don't expect mercy from a system that equates justice with public spectacle. The flogging ends, and the unconscious man is cut down and dragged away by relatives who look like they're trying to decide whether he's lucky to be alive or unlucky to have survived. The crowd begins to disperse, satisfied that they've witnessed proper justice being administered and reassured that the social order remains intact through the application of organized violence. But the court isn't finished. There's another case to be heard, this one involving a woman accused of stealing bread from her neighbor. The evidence is circumstantial. The accused is obviously pregnant and desperate, and the penalty for theft is considerably more severe than what you just witnessed. You're starting to realize that medieval justice operates on the principle that punishment should always be worse than the crime, just to make sure the lesson sticks. The boyar calls for witnesses, and several townspeople step forward to offer testimony that sounds suspiciously like gossip dressed up as evidence. Medieval courts apparently didn't draw sharp distinctions between facts and rumors, and the burden of proof seemed to rest more on popular opinion than on actual evidence. As you stand there watching your neighbors enthusiastically participate in judicial proceedings that could easily result in someone's death, you can't help but think that maybe staying home and freezing to death might be preferable to living in a world where justice is administered with whips and property disputes are settled with public floggings. The pregnant woman is found guilty and sentenced to the stocks for 3 days, which sounds almost merciful until you realize that 3 days of public humiliation in medieval weather conditions is basically a death sentence with extra steps. You watch the pregnant woman being led to the stocks, a medieval contraption designed to maximize both physical discomfort and social humiliation, and decide that maybe this is an excellent time to seek spiritual guidance, not because you've suddenly discovered religion, but because the church is one of the few places in medieval Novgorod where you might find shelter from the cold without immediately being robbed, flogged, or eaten by wolves. The wooden church dominates the town center like a brooding giant, its onion domes rising into the gray sky with the kind of architectural ambition that seems wildly optimistic in a world where most people live in single-room hovels. The sound of bells has been echoing across the town all day, not the cheerful chiming you might expect, but deep, ominous tolling that seems designed to remind everyone that death is always just around the corner. You push open the heavy wooden doors and step into a world that assaults your senses with the intensity of a medieval sensory overload experiment. The air is thick with incense, clouds of frankincense and myrrh that create a fog so dense you can barely see the altar through the haze. The smell is overwhelming, a mixture of exotic spices and burning resins that makes your eyes water and your throat close up. The mainstream historical fact about medieval Russian Orthodoxy is that it was intensely ritualistic, with services that could last for hours and involved elaborate ceremonies designed to create a sense of otherworldly mystery. The incense wasn't just for atmosphere. It was believed to carry prayers heavenward and create a physical barrier between the sacred and the profane. But here's where medieval reality gets particularly uncomfortable. The church is packed with people, and medieval personal hygiene standards mean that the incense is fighting a losing battle against the collective aroma of unwashed humanity. You're breathing a cocktail of holy smoke and human funk that would make a modern air freshener company weep with despair. The service is already underway, conducted in Old Church Slavonic by a priest whose voice echoes through the stone building with all the warmth and comfort of a funeral dirge. You can't understand most of what he's saying, which is probably intentional. Medieval Christianity believed that mystery was an essential component of faith, and nothing was more mysterious than prayers in a language that most worshippers couldn't comprehend. You find a spot near the back of the church, squeezed between a peasant woman who's muttering prayers while fingering a wooden cross and a merchant who keeps glancing nervously at the door like he's expecting the Mongol tax collectors to burst in and demand tribute from God himself. The stone floor is cold enough to leach the warmth from your body through your thin shoes, and you realize that medieval worship was apparently designed to be as physically uncomfortable as possible. A quirky historical tidbit that might interest you while you're trying not to freeze to death during the liturgy. Medieval Russian churches sometimes kept bears chained near the entrance as a form of religious theater. The bears were meant to represent the wild, untamed world outside the church, and their presence was supposed to remind worshippers of the chaos that faith could protect them from. Unfortunately, the bears occasionally escaped, which added an element of genuine terror to the religious experience. The service seems to go on forever, with the priest working his way through prayers, chants, and rituals that appear to have been designed by someone who believed that spiritual enlightenment could only be achieved through extreme endurance testing. People around you are crossing themselves with mechanical regularity, bowing at predetermined moments, and participating in responses that sound like they're being delivered by a congregation of sleepwalkers. But underneath the droning liturgy, you start to pick up on whispered conversations that suggest the church serves as more than just a place of worship. It's also the medieval equivalent of a news network. Rumors are being passed from person to person in hushed tones that somehow manage to be both reverent and gossipy at the same time. You hear fragments of conversations about heretics being discovered in nearby villages, about strange omens and portents, about church officials who've been accused of various sins that would probably be considered fairly minor by modern standards, but are apparently scandalous enough to warrant whispered discussion during divine service. Medieval Christianity apparently didn't distinguish sharply between spiritual guidance and community gossip. The woman next to you leans over and whispers something about a monk who's been preaching dangerous ideas about the nature of salvation, ideas that sound suspiciously like they might make sense to ordinary people, which is apparently why they're considered heretical. Medieval theological orthodoxy was apparently less concerned with truth than with maintaining the proper level of incomprehensible mystery. Historians still argue whether medieval Russian orthodoxy was genuinely spiritual or primarily a form of social control, but from your position in the freezing church, breathing incense-flavored body odor while listening to prayers in a foreign language, the distinction seems less important than the immediate question of whether you can survive the service without passing out. The priest begins a particularly elaborate ritual involving what appears to be the blessing of various objects, crosses, icons, holy water, and other religious paraphernalia that gleam in the candlelight like medieval special effects. The congregation responds with increased fervor, crossing themselves more vigorously and muttering prayers with the kind of desperate intensity that suggests they're not entirely confident that God is paying attention. You notice that several people are making what appear to be confession gestures, touching their hearts and looking skyward with expressions of guilt and hope. Medieval confession was apparently a public spectacle rather than a private matter, and you're starting to realize that everyone around you is probably cataloging your sins while simultaneously worrying about their own. The incense continues to thicken, creating a fog that makes the church feel like it's floating in some kind of religious cloud. The candles flicker in the haze, casting dancing shadows on the walls that make the painted saints and martyrs seem to move and writhe in the smoky air. Medieval churches were apparently designed to create altered states of consciousness through sensory overload. As the service drags on, you start to understand why medieval people were so obsessed with the afterlife. If this world involved standing in freezing churches, breathing toxic levels of incense while listening to incomprehensible prayers, the promise of eternal rest probably seemed like a significant upgrade. The priest shows no signs of winding down, and you're beginning to suspect that medieval services were designed to last until either divine intervention occurred or the congregation died of exposure. The service finally ends, though ends might be too generous a term for what feels more like a temporary ceasefire in the war between your soul and medieval liturgical endurance, and you stumble out of the church with your ears ringing and your lungs burning from industrial strength incense. The fresh air hits you like a blessing, even though it's still cold enough to freeze your breath into little puffs of relief. But your spiritual education isn't over yet, because tonight happens to be one of those special medieval occasions when the local boyar opens his hall to the community for a feast. And by feast, you should understand that this is less about generous hospitality and more about a calculated display of power, wealth, and the social hierarchy that keeps people like you firmly planted at the bottom of the medieval food chain. The boyar's hall looms before you like a wooden cathedral dedicated to the worship of political intimidation. It's the largest building in town after the church, constructed from logs that probably required the deforestation of half the surrounding countryside. Smoke pours from multiple chimneys, and the warm light spilling from the windows creates the illusion that something welcoming awaits inside, which is your first clue that appearances in medieval Russia are almost always deceiving. You join the line of townspeople shuffling toward the entrance, and immediately notice that medieval social events operate on a strict caste system that would make modern country clubs look egalitarian. The wealthy merchants and local officials stride directly to the front entrance, while people like you are directed toward a side door that leads to what amounts to the medieval equivalent of the kids' table. The mainstream historical fact about medieval Russian feasts is that they served multiple social functions. They demonstrated the host's wealth and generosity, reinforced social hierarchies, and provided opportunities for political networking that could determine everything from trade agreements to marriage alliances. But here's where the reality diverges from your expectations of medieval hospitality. You're ushered into the hall through the servant's entrance and immediately hit by a wall of heat, noise, and smells that create a sensory assault unlike anything you've experienced since the bathhouse incident. The air is thick with the smoke from multiple fires, the grease from roasting meat, and the collective body odor of several hundred people who've been drinking fermented beverages and celebrating their survival through another day of medieval existence. The hall is arranged like a medieval theater of social stratification. At the head of the room, the boyar sits at a raised table with his family and honored guests, feasting on what appears to be an entire menagerie of roasted animals. Below them, arranged in careful order of importance, are the merchants, craftsmen, and other worthies of the community. And at the very back, squeezed onto rough wooden benches that seem designed to remind you of your place in the cosmic order, are the peasants, laborers, and other expendable members of society. A quirky historical tidbit that might amuse you while you're trying to find somewhere to sit. Medieval Russian feasts often featured elaborate entertainments, including trained bears that performed tricks, wandering minstrels who sang epic ballads, and occasionally public executions for the amusement of the guests. Medieval people apparently believed that the combination of food, alcohol, and violence created the perfect party atmosphere. You manage to squeeze onto a bench next to a blacksmith who smells like he's been marinating in his own forged smoke, and a farmer whose idea of feast attire apparently involves the same clothes he wears to muck out animal stalls. The conversation around you is a mixture of complaints about taxes, speculation about the weather, and increasingly drunk observations about the unfairness of a social system that keeps all the good food at the front of the room. The food that eventually makes its way to your section of the hall bears only a passing resemblance to what the boyar and his guests are enjoying. While they're carving up whole roasted pigs and fowl that glisten with fat and herbs, you're presented with a wooden bowl containing what appears to be a stew made from whatever scraps and leftovers couldn't be served to anyone important. The stew contains identifiable chunks of meat, though meat might be a generous term for what looks like gristle, connective tissue, and parts of animals that you prefer not to think about too carefully. There are also vegetables that have been boiled into submission, creating a gray, lumpy mass that has the texture of wet sawdust and roughly the same nutritional appeal. But medieval etiquette demands that you eat whatever you're served with expressions of gratitude, because complaining about free food, even inedible free food, is considered worse manners than serving garbage to your guests. You dig in with the wooden spoon provided, trying not to think too hard about what you're putting in your mouth while simultaneously being grateful that the dim lighting makes it difficult to examine your meal too closely. The beer that accompanies the meal is warm, flat, and has the kind of bitter aftertaste that suggests it was brewed from ingredients that were already questionable before fermentation began. But it's alcoholic, which means it's probably safer than the water, and after a few swallows, you start to understand why medieval people seemed to drink constantly. It was less about celebration than about chemical pain management for the experience of being alive in the 13th century. As the evening progresses and the alcohol takes effect, the social barriers that normally keep the different classes separated begin to break down in ways that are both entertaining and terrifying. Conversations become louder, more honest, and significantly more dangerous as people start saying things that they would never dare express when sober. Historians still argue whether medieval feasts were genuine expressions of community solidarity or elaborate displays of social control disguised as hospitality. But from your position at the peasant table, watching drunk nobles make increasingly bad decisions while their sober guards watch everything with professional alertness, the answer seems pretty obvious. You overhear fragments of conversations that suggest the evening's entertainment is just getting started. There's talk of settling old grudges, of business deals that might be concluded with handshakes or knife fights, and of romantic entanglements that sound like they're going to end badly for everyone involved. Medieval social gatherings apparently served as pressure release valves for tensions that have been building up throughout the year. The boyar himself is getting progressively more intoxicated, and his speeches are becoming more rambling and less coherent. He's holding forth on topics ranging from the incompetence of the Mongol administrators to his own military prowess, with occasional detours into philosophy that would probably be more impressive if he weren't slurring his words and occasionally forgetting what point he was trying to make. The boyar's philosophical rambling is interrupted by a commotion near the entrance that sends a chill through the hall, more effective than any winter wind. A messenger has arrived, and from the look on his face, pale, wide-eyed, and breathing hard from what was obviously a desperate ride, he's not bringing news about a successful harvest or favorable trade agreements. Medieval messengers who looked this terrified usually meant one thing: plague. The word spreads through the hall like spilled wine soaking into wood, whispered from table to table in a mixture of languages and dialects that somehow all manage to convey the same bone-deep terror. Plague, pestilence, the Black Death. The names don't matter. What matters is that somewhere, maybe not very far away, people are dying in ways that make medieval warfare look like a gentle disagreement between reasonable neighbors. The messenger approaches the boyar's table and delivers his report in a voice that carries clearly through the suddenly silent hall. A trading caravan from the south has arrived with more than just goods. They've brought reports of villages emptied, cities quarantined, and a sickness that kills faster than people can dig graves. The mainstream historical fact is that plague was a constant threat in medieval Russia, spreading along trade routes and river systems with devastating efficiency. You watch the boyar's face go through a series of expressions as he processes the news: confusion, disbelief, calculation, and finally, the kind of cold fear that comes from understanding that wealth and power provide no protection against microscopic death. Medieval nobles might have been insulated from many of life's unpleasantries, but plague was remarkably democratic in its choice of victims. The hall erupts in a mixture of panicked conversation and desperate prayers as people try to process information that doesn't quite fit into their medieval understanding of how the world works. Some blame divine wrath for humanity's sins. Others suspect foreign enemies of deliberately spreading poison. A few more practical souls immediately start planning evacuation routes, though where exactly you'd evacuate to in a world where every destination is potentially infected remains unclear. A quirky historical tidbit that probably won't comfort anyone. Medieval people believed that plague could be transmitted through bad air, or miasma, which led to the practice of carrying aromatic herbs and spices to ward off infection. Wealthy people would stuff their clothes with expensive imported spices, while poor people made do with whatever local plants they could find. The result was that plague outbreaks often smelled like a spice market, having a nervous breakdown. The conversation around your table has taken on the urgent, desperate quality of people trying to solve an unsolvable problem through sheer volume of discussion. The blacksmith is convinced that fire can purify anything, including air, and is proposing that the entire town be surrounded by burning braziers. The farmer thinks that certain animals can sense plague before humans can, and suggests that everyone should watch their livestock for signs of unusual behavior. Someone mentions that prayer and fasting can protect the faithful, which leads to a theological debate about whether God sends plague as punishment or as a test of faith. Medieval Christianity had conflicting theories about divine justice, and plague outbreaks tended to bring these contradictions into sharp, uncomfortable focus. If God was benevolent, why did babies die? If plague was punishment for sin, why did it often spare the obviously wicked while destroying the apparently virtuous? You notice that several people are already touching wooden crosses, holy medals, and other religious talismans with the kind of desperate intensity that suggests they're not entirely confident in their protective powers. Medieval superstition operated on the principle that more protection was always better than less, even when the different protective measures contradicted each other. The boyar calls for order and begins issuing commands with the kind of authoritative confidence that medieval leaders used to mask their complete inability to deal with problems beyond their understanding. Guards are dispatched to monitor the roads for suspicious travelers. The town gates are to be closed at sunset and opened only for known residents. Anyone showing signs of illness is to be isolated immediately, though nobody seems entirely clear on what signs of illness might include or where the isolation is supposed to take place. Historians still argue whether medieval quarantine measures were effective against plague transmission or simply provided the illusion of control during uncontrollable circumstances. But from your position in the hall, watching people frantically try to create barriers against an invisible enemy, the distinction seems academic. The important thing is that everyone is doing something, even if that something is probably useless. The feast atmosphere has completely evaporated, replaced by the kind of tense urgency that comes from realizing that your next meal might be your last. People are no longer drinking for pleasure, they're drinking for courage, for comfort, or for the slim hope that alcohol might somehow sterilize whatever invisible threats are already circulating in the air around them. Conversations are becoming increasingly frantic as people try to remember every cough they've heard, every fever they've noticed, every unexplained death from the past few weeks. Medieval diagnostic techniques weren't exactly sophisticated, so distinguishing between ordinary illness and plague symptoms was basically impossible until people started dying in numbers that couldn't be explained by normal medieval mortality rates. You overhear someone mention that the monastery outside town has reported several recent deaths among the monks, which sends a fresh wave of panic through the hall. If plague could penetrate monasteries, places dedicated to prayer, purification, and holy living, then nowhere was safe. Medieval people relied heavily on the belief that spiritual purity provided physical protection, and evidence to the contrary was deeply unsettling. The evening's entertainment has been quietly cancelled, though nobody announces this officially. The trained bears, wandering minstrels, and other performers seem to have melted away into the night, probably calculating that plague-panicked audiences weren't ideal for their particular forms of medieval performance art. Even the servants are moving more quickly and efficiently than usual, as if speed might somehow protect them from airborne contagion. As the evening winds down, or more accurately, collapses under the weight of existential terror, people begin making their excuses and heading home to barricade themselves behind whatever protection they can improvise. Medieval plague response was largely a matter of individual survival strategies, and community solidarity tended to evaporate when death became a personal rather than theoretical concern. You gather up what's left of your dignity and prepare to join the exodus, but you can't shake the feeling that you're walking out of the hall and into a world that has fundamentally changed in the space of a single evening. The news of plague has transformed Novgorod from a difficult but manageable medieval town into a potential death trap, where every breath might be your last, every cough might be a death sentence, and every stranger might be carrying invisible doom. You step out of the boyar's hall into the night air that now feels charged with invisible menace, every breath potentially carrying microscopic death into your lungs. The streets of Novgorod have transformed in the span of a single evening. What were once familiar paths between neighbors' homes have become potential disease corridors, where every shadow might hide a plague victim, and every doorway might conceal someone coughing their life away in solitary agony. The sound that greets you as you make your way through the darkened streets isn't the usual medieval nighttime symphony of snoring domestic arguments and the occasional drunk stumbling home. Instead, you hear something far more ominous, the rhythmic pounding of hammers and the scrape of wood being dragged across frozen ground. The siege preparations have begun, not against an army of human enemies, but against the invisible forces of pestilence that might already be creeping through the town's defenses. You can see torches bobbing in the darkness as work crews labor through the night to strengthen the wooden palisades that surround Novgorod. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval Russian towns were typically defended by earthwork ramparts topped with wooden walls and towers, designed primarily to resist human attackers. But plague required different defensive strategies, ones that medieval military engineering had never been designed to handle. The irony isn't lost on you that the same walls built to keep enemies out might now be trapping disease inside, but medieval logic operated on the principle that barriers were always better than no barriers, even when the thing you were trying to stop could potentially pass through solid wood. The workers are reinforcing gates, boarding up unused entrances, and creating choke points that will theoretically allow guards to inspect everyone who tries to enter or leave the town. But even as you watch the frantic construction activity, you can hear other sounds that suggest the siege has already begun. From somewhere in the distance comes the unmistakable sound of digging. not the organized excavation of defensive earthworks, but the desperate, urgent digging of people preparing graves faster than they ever hoped they'd need to. Medieval towns always maintained cemeteries, but plague required industrial-scale burial operations that normal funeral arrangements couldn't handle. A quirky historical tidbit that might interest you while you're contemplating your own mortality. Medieval Russian siege warfare sometimes involved catapulting diseased corpses over enemy walls as a form of biological warfare. The practice was considered so effective that some military commanders kept stockpiles of plague victims specifically for ammunition purposes. Unfortunately, this defensive knowledge was less helpful when the disease was already inside the walls, and you were essentially under siege from your own dead. You're making your way toward your hut when you encounter your first refugee, a woman carrying a small child and pulling a wooden cart loaded with whatever possessions she managed to grab before fleeing her home. She's moving with the kind of determined desperation that suggests she's not entirely sure where she's going, but she's absolutely certain that staying where she was would have been fatal. She stops when she sees you, and for a moment you both stand there in the torchlight, trying to decide whether the other person represents safety, dangers, or just another fellow victim of circumstances beyond anyone's control. Medieval plague etiquette was still being invented, and nobody was quite sure whether helping strangers was charitable or suicidal. "They're dying in the next village over," she whispers, as if speaking too loudly might attract the attention of whatever invisible forces are spreading death across the countryside. Started 3 days ago with fever and swelling. By yesterday, they were throwing bodies into a pit because there wasn't time to dig individual graves. Her words hang in the cold air, like a death sentence, and you realize that you're probably hearing the most accurate news report you're likely to get about the plague's progress. Medieval communication systems weren't exactly reliable under the best circumstances, but when people were dying faster than messengers could travel, eyewitness accounts from survivors became the only trustworthy source of information. The child in her arms coughs, just a small, ordinary cough that would normally be completely unremarkable, and both of you freeze as if the sound were a cannon shot. Medieval parents had watched their children die from dozens of different diseases, but plague had made every symptom a potential death warrant. The woman clutches her child closer and hurries away into the darkness, probably wondering if she's protecting him or carrying his doom with her. You continue toward your hut, but the streets seem different now, not just darker, but actively malevolent, as if the familiar buildings and pathways have been transformed into a maze designed to trap victims rather than shelter residents. Every doorway you pass might conceal someone dying alone. Every window might hide someone too sick to call for help, and every shadow might be hiding evidence of deaths that haven't been discovered yet. Historians still argue whether medieval siege warfare was more psychologically devastating than the actual combat, but from your current perspective, walking through streets that feel like they're actively trying to kill you, the distinction seems irrelevant. The siege drums you're hearing aren't being played by human enemies. They're the sound of your own heart beating fast enough to remind you that you're still alive, at least for now. The work crews are still laboring by torchlight, their hammers and saws creating a soundtrack of desperate construction that echoes off the buildings like some kind of medieval industrial symphony. But underneath the noise of building and fortification, you can hear other sounds that suggest not everyone is focused on defense. Someone is wailing, the kind of raw, throat-tearing grief that comes from discovering that all your preparation and precaution arrived too late to save the people you were trying to protect. You reach your own hut and pause before lifting the wooden bar that serves as your door lock, suddenly aware that crossing the threshold might be stepping into a trap. Medieval homes weren't exactly airtight, and if plague could travel through the air, then your hut might already be contaminated by invisible death that entered while you were away at the feast. But standing outside in the freezing night isn't exactly a long-term survival strategy either, so you take a deep breath, possibly your last comfortable breath for a very long time, and step inside. The familiar smoke and cold greet you like old friends, and for a moment you almost manage to convince yourself that nothing has changed, that the news of plague is just another medieval rumor that will prove to be exaggerated by morning. Then you hear the sound that destroys any hope of denial, howling from the forest beyond the town walls, but not the familiar wolf calls you heard earlier. This is something different, something that sounds almost human but not quite. as if the plague has reached even the wild animals and transformed them into something between beast and victim. The siege has begun, and you're trapped inside walls that might be protecting you from external enemies or sealing you inside with internal doom. Medieval survival has just become a much more complex calculation. The howling from the forest gradually fades into an ominous silence that's somehow worse than the unnatural sounds, leaving you alone in your smoke-filled hut with nothing but the crackling of your dying fire and the growing realization that tomorrow, if you survive to see it, you're going to have to venture outside and pretend that normal medieval life is still possible. The irony isn't lost on you that after spending the day worrying about wolves, taxes, and bandits, you're now facing the prospect that your biggest enemy might be the very air you're breathing. Sleep, when it finally comes, is fitful and filled with dreams of invisible enemies and the faces of people you saw at the feast who might already be dead by morning. You wake before dawn to the sound of church bells, not the regular call to morning prayers, but the irregular, frantic tolling that medieval communities use to signal emergencies. Someone has died during the night, and the bell ringer is announcing it to a town that's probably been expecting this news since yesterday evening. You stumble outside into the pre-dawn darkness and immediately notice that the streets are busier than they should be at this hour. People are moving with purpose, but not the usual medieval morning routine of heading to work or market. Instead, they're moving like refugees in their own town, carrying bundles and looking over their shoulders as if they expect to be pursued by something they can't see, but absolutely believe is there. The first body appears just after sunrise. An elderly merchant found dead in his shop, apparently having succumbed during the night to what everyone is trying very hard not to call plague. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval Russian communities had established procedures for dealing with sudden deaths, but these procedures assumed that bodies would be discovered one at a time, not in the kind of numbers that plague could produce. You join the small crowd that's gathered outside the merchant's shop, everyone maintaining a careful distance from each other while trying to get close enough to see what's happening. Medieval curiosity was apparently stronger than medieval self-preservation instincts, though everyone is breathing through cloth held over their mouths and noses, as if a thin layer of linen could somehow filter out death itself. The body is wrapped in whatever fabric could be found and loaded onto a cart that's been hastily pressed into service as a hearse. The driver, a young man who drew the short straw in whatever lottery determined who would handle plague victims, looks like he's trying to hold his breath for the entire journey. Medieval funeral arrangements were normally elaborate affairs involving family, friends, and religious ceremonies, but plague had reduced death to a logistical problem that needed to be solved quickly and efficiently. Here's a quirky historical tidbit that might provide some grim comfort. Medieval Russian communities sometimes appointed official body collectors during plague outbreaks, usually criminals or desperate poor people who were paid premium wages to handle the dead. The job had a remarkably high turnover rate, not because of employee dissatisfaction, but because the body collectors tended to become bodies themselves within a few weeks of starting work. The fields outside town that were designated as the emergency burial ground are already showing signs of recent excavation, long trenches that look suspiciously like mass graves, though nobody is using that term officially. Medieval euphemisms were apparently important for maintaining morale, so the trenches are being called temporary interment facilities, or communal resting places, as if creative terminology could somehow make death less final. But the real sign that Novgorod is under siege from an invisible enemy becomes apparent when you try to go about your normal routine and discover that normal no longer exists. The market is closed, not because it's too early, but because half the vendors are missing and the other half are too scared to handle goods that might be contaminated. Medieval commerce depended on physical contact, haggling, and the examination of merchandise, all of which had suddenly become potentially fatal activities. The few shops that are still open have implemented what amounts to medieval social distancing, transactions conducted through windows, goods passed back and forth on long sticks, and payment left in bowls of vinegar that's supposed to somehow neutralize whatever invisible death might be clinging to the coins. Medieval currency had never been particularly clean, but now every copper piece was treated like a potential murder weapon. You're standing in what used to be the market square, trying to figure out how to obtain food in a world where commerce has been replaced by terror, when you notice the smell. It's subtle at first, just a faint sweetness in the air that doesn't quite belong with the usual medieval aromatherapy of smoke, sewage, and unwashed humanity. But as the morning progresses, the smell gets stronger, and you start to realize that you're breathing the collective exhalation of a town where people are dying faster than they can be properly buried. The work that needs to be done, farming, crafting, trading, all the activities that keep medieval communities alive, is still there, but now it has to be accomplished by people who are increasingly convinced that leaving their homes might be a death sentence. Medieval agriculture was already a marginal operation under the best circumstances. When farmers were afraid to work their fields, the entire food supply system began to collapse with frightening speed. Historians still argue whether medieval plague outbreaks were more devastating because of the disease itself or because of the social and economic disruption they caused. But from your position in an increasingly empty market square, watching the basic infrastructure of daily life disappear before your eyes, the academic distinction seems irrelevant. When people stop working, trading, and interacting, civilization doesn't gradually decline. It falls apart like a house built from cards. You notice that the few people who are still venturing outside are developing new behavioral patterns that would have seemed insane just a few days ago. They're walking in the middle of streets to avoid contact with buildings that might harbor infected air. They're carrying bundles of herbs and flowers to ward off invisible death. Some are wearing multiple layers of clothing, as if extra fabric could somehow create a barrier against microscopic enemies. The most disturbing sight is the children. The few who are still allowed outside are playing games that incorporate plague into their medieval childhood activities. They're pretending to be plague doctors, acting out elaborate death scenes, and singing songs about invisible enemies that would have been unthinkable before yesterday's news. Medieval children had always lived close to death, but now death had become the primary theme of their entertainment. As the day progresses, you start to understand that the siege isn't just happening around you, it's happening inside your own mind. Every cough becomes a potential death sentence. Every fever is scrutinized for signs of plague. Every interaction with another person involves calculating whether human contact is worth the risk of infection. Medieval paranoia was becoming a survival skill, and trust was transforming into a luxury that might literally kill you. The church bells continue their irregular tolling throughout the day, announcing each new death to a community that's already prepared for the worst. By evening, you've counted at least a dozen separate death announcements, and you're starting to suspect that the bell ringer is falling behind in his grim bookkeeping. Night falls like a shroud over Novgorod, but darkness brings no relief from the siege of invisible death. Instead, it amplifies every sound, every fear, and every whisper of the old beliefs that Christianity was supposed to have buried centuries ago. You're huddled in your hut, trying to decide whether the smoke from your fire is protection against airborne plague, or just another way to slowly poison yourself when you hear the sound that makes your medieval blood run cold. Drumming from the forest, rhythmic and deliberate, with undertones that seem to vibrate through the earth itself. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval Russian Christianity was layered over much older pagan traditions that never completely disappeared, especially in rural areas where church authority was weak and ancient practices provided comfort that official religion couldn't match. But here's where medieval reality gets particularly unsettling. When people are dying from invisible enemies that Christian prayers can't seem to stop, those old gods start looking increasingly attractive. The drumming grows louder, joined by what sounds like chanting in a language that predates the arrival of Orthodox missionaries by centuries. Someone, or several someones, has decided that if Christian protection isn't working against the plague, maybe it's time to try negotiations with older, hungrier deities who might be more interested in making deals with desperate mortals. You crack open your door and peer into the night, immediately regretting the decision as the cold air hits your face like a slap from winter itself. But what you see in the distance is worse than the cold. Flickering lights moving through the forest in patterns that definitely aren't random, accompanied by sounds that blend human voices with something wilder, more primal, and significantly less concerned with medieval concepts of salvation and damnation. A quirky historical tidbit that might explain what you're witnessing. Medieval Russian folklore preserved detailed knowledge of pre-Christian rituals designed to appease forest spirits, household gods, and other supernatural entities that were believed to control everything from weather to disease. These rituals often involved offerings of food, alcohol, and sometimes blood, delivered in sacred groves that had been holy long before the first church was built. The problem with medieval pagan revival movements was that nobody could quite remember the correct procedures, so what you're witnessing is probably a mixture of half-remembered ancient wisdom and desperate improvisation by people who figure that any supernatural intervention is better than none. The chanting has the kind of urgent, frantic quality that suggests the participants aren't entirely confident in their theological accuracy, but are absolutely convinced that something needs to be done. You're debating whether to investigate or barricade yourself more thoroughly when a figure appears at your door. A woman from the village whose face is painted with what appears to be a mixture of ash, mud, and something dark that you prefer not to identify. She's carrying a bundle of herbs that smell like they were gathered from the deepest, most forbidden parts of the forest, and her eyes have the kind of bright intensity that comes from either spiritual enlightenment or complete psychological breakdown. "The old ways," she whispers, as if speaking too loudly might attract the attention of either Christian authorities or pagan deities who might disapprove of her theological flexibility. The plague spirits don't understand church Latin, but they remember the old words, the old bargains. Come to the grove if you want to live. Medieval religious syncretism was apparently alive and well in Novgorod, at least among people desperate enough to hedge their bets by appealing to multiple supernatural power structures simultaneously. The woman disappears into the night before you can ask questions like which grove, or what kind of bargains, or are you completely insane? But the drumming is getting closer, and you're starting to hear individual voices in the chanting, people you recognize from the market, the church, and yesterday's feast, all apparently participating in what amounts to a medieval theological experiment that would probably result in excommunication if the church authorities weren't busy dealing with more immediate concerns, like blessing the dead and trying not to become dead themselves. You're still trying to decide whether joining a pagan revival movement is better or worse than dying of plague in your hut, when you notice that the smoke from your fire is behaving strangely. Instead of rising straight up through the hole in your roof, it's swirling in patterns that seem almost deliberate, as if the air currents inside your hut are being influenced by forces that don't normally concern themselves with medieval ventilation systems. Historians still argue whether medieval pagan practices were genuine spiritual traditions or just psychological comfort mechanisms for people dealing with circumstances beyond their control. But from your position in a smoke-filled hut listening to ancient chants designed to negotiate with supernatural entities, the distinction seems less important than the immediate question of whether you're about to be visited by something that predates Christianity by several millennia. The drumming reaches a crescendo, and suddenly the forest erupts in a blaze of bonfires that illuminate the night like medieval special effects. You can see figures dancing around the flames, not the careful, reverent movements of church rituals, but wild, ecstatic celebrations that seem designed to attract attention from entities that normal people spend their entire lives trying to avoid. The smoke from the forest fires begins drifting toward town, carrying with it the smell of burning herbs, sacrificial offerings, and something else that makes your primitive survival instincts start screaming warnings about dangers that civilized consciousness doesn't want to acknowledge. Medieval air quality was already questionable, but now you're breathing smoke that's been deliberately infused with ingredients designed to facilitate communication with supernatural forces. You notice that other people in town are responding to the forest activities. Some are barricading their doors and windows more thoroughly, while others are gathering whatever offerings they can find and heading toward the tree line with the kind of determined desperation that suggests they've decided that ancient forest spirits are more likely to provide protection than modern Christian prayers. The chanting has evolved into something that includes recognizable words, mixed with sounds that don't belong to any human language you've ever heard. Medieval linguistic traditions preserved fragments of pre-Christian invocations, but what you're hearing now sounds like those fragments have been combined with improvised additions created by people who are making up theological procedures as they go along. As the night progresses, the boundary between Christian Novgorod and pagan forest becomes increasingly blurred. The church bells have stopped tolling, Whether because the bell ringer has joined the forest rituals or because he's become another plague victim is unclear, and the forest drums have become the dominant soundtrack for whatever is happening to your medieval understanding of reality. The smoke from the pagan bonfires continues to drift through town, and you're starting to notice that it has effects beyond just making your eyes water. People who breathe too much of it begin moving differently, speaking in languages that sound familiar but use words and combinations that don't quite make sense, and looking at familiar surroundings as if they're seeing additional layers of reality that normal consciousness usually filters out. You're still trying to process the theological implications of breathing smoke that's designed to facilitate conversations with pre-Christian forest spirits when a new sound cuts through the night, the distinctive creak and groan of wooden wheels on frozen ground, accompanied by voices that are trying very hard to sound casual while discussing what is obviously contraband. The secret vodka trade has arrived in plague-stricken Novgorod because apparently even invisible death can't stop medieval entrepreneurs from finding ways to profit from human misery. The cart that rumbles past your hut in the darkness is loaded with what the driver claims are medicinal supplies, but the smell wafting from beneath the canvas covering suggests that these particular medicines have been distilled rather than brewed, and their primary therapeutic benefit involves helping people forget that they're probably going to die horribly in the very near future. Medieval pharmacology was apparently more concerned with symptom management than actual cures. You follow the cart at a discreet distance, partly out of curiosity and partly because the combination of plague terror and pagan smoke has left you in need of something stronger than the watered-down beer that normally passes for safe drinking water in medieval Russia. The mainstream historical fact is that distilled spirits were relatively new to medieval Russia, having been introduced through trade contacts with Western Europe, but they quickly became popular for both medicinal and recreational purposes. The cart stops at what appears to be an ordinary peasant hut, but the number of people emerging from the shadows suggests that this particular dwelling has become the medieval equivalent of a speakeasy. The driver exchanges quiet words with someone who's obviously serving as a lookout. Money changes hands with practiced efficiency, and wooden casks are unloaded with the kind of careful reverence usually reserved for religious relics. Here's a quirky historical tidbit that might explain the sudden popularity of illicit alcohol. Medieval people believed that strong spirits could burn away disease, both literally and figuratively. The theory was that anything powerful enough to make you feel like your throat was on fire was probably capable of incinerating whatever invisible enemies might be lurking in your bloodstream. Medieval medical theory wasn't exactly sophisticated, but it was remarkably optimistic about the therapeutic benefits of getting spectacularly drunk. You join the queue of desperate customers waiting to purchase liquid courage, and immediately notice that plague has created some interesting changes in medieval social dynamics. People who would normally never associate with each other, merchants and laborers, church officials and known criminals, respectable wives and questionable women, are all standing together in democratic desperation, united by their shared need for chemical assistance in dealing with circumstances that sober consciousness can't handle. The proprietor of this underground establishment is a gap-toothed woman who's clearly been in the illegal alcohol business long enough to develop a professional attitude toward her customers' various forms of desperation. She's dispensing vodka from ceramic jugs with the efficiency of someone who understands that her clients aren't here for the ambiance. They're here for oblivion, and they want it as quickly and cheaply as possible. The vodka itself is a far cry from the refined spirits that modern drinkers might expect. It's clear, certainly, but it has the kind of harsh burn that suggests it was distilled by someone who prioritized potency over palatability. One sip feels like swallowing liquid fire, and your eyes immediately begin watering in ways that have nothing to do with emotional distress, and everything to do with consuming what amounts to medieval paint thinner. But the alcohol works exactly as advertised. Within minutes, the existential terror of living through a plague outbreak begins to fade into a more manageable background anxiety, and the sounds of pagan rituals from the forest start to seem less like harbingers of supernatural doom, and more like an interesting cultural phenomenon that you're observing from a safe psychological distance. The other customers are experiencing similar transformations. Conversations that started as whispered exchanges of plague rumors are evolving into increasingly loud and philosophical discussions about the nature of death, the reliability of various gods, and the question of whether getting drunk during a pandemic is spiritually irresponsible or strategically brilliant. Medieval drinking culture apparently encouraged theological debate. Someone starts singing, not a church hymn or a traditional folk song, but something that sounds like it was composed on the spot by someone who's discovered that alcohol provides excellent inspiration for artistic expression, but terrible quality control for the results. The song incorporates elements of Christian prayer, pagan invocation, and what appears to be a detailed complaint about medieval taxation policies. Historians still argue whether medieval alcohol consumption was primarily about social bonding or individual coping mechanisms, but from your position in an illegal tavern surrounded by plague refugees who are getting progressively more intoxicated while discussing their preferred methods of supernatural intervention, the distinction seems academic. Everyone is drinking for the same reason. Reality has become too terrible to experience sober. The proprietor keeps the vodka flowing with the professional competence of someone who understands that her customer's sobriety is bad for business and potentially fatal for their mental health. She accepts payment in coins, goods, promises of future payment, and occasionally information about which houses in town might be worth robbing once their owners die of plague. As the night progresses and the alcohol takes effect, the secret tavern begins to feel like a medieval support group for people dealing with apocalyptic circumstances. Strangers are sharing their deepest fears, their most desperate hopes, and their increasingly creative theories about how to survive when all the traditional survival strategies have proven inadequate. You find yourself in conversation with a merchant who's convinced that plague is divine punishment for the community's insufficient devotion to proper religious observances, a farmer who believes that the disease was deliberately introduced by foreign enemies, and a church deacon who's secretly wondering whether the pagan forest rituals might be worth investigating as a backup plan if Christian prayers continue to prove ineffective. The alcohol is making everyone more honest than medieval social conventions usually allow, and you're getting an education in exactly how much fear, desperation, and theological confusion your neighbors have been hiding behind their normal facades of stoic acceptance. Medieval emotional expression was apparently much more complex than the historical records suggest. The illegal vodka session is interrupted by a sound that cuts through even the alcohol-induced haze like a sword through silk, the heavy wooden doors of the tavern slamming open to reveal a figure that makes everyone's medieval blood freeze in their veins. It's not the town guards, not the church authorities, and definitely not the Mongol tax collectors. It's something worse, the local priest holding what appears to be a glowing iron rod and wearing the kind of expression that suggests he's about to provide a practical demonstration of medieval justice that none of the assembled drinkers are going to enjoy. Trial by ordeal, he announces in a voice that echoes through the suddenly silent tavern like a death sentence delivered by divine authority. Someone has accused the tavern keeper of spreading plague through her illegal alcohol, and medieval justice has decided that the best way to determine guilt or innocence is to make the accused handle red-hot metal while everyone watches to see whether God intervenes to protect the innocent or allows the guilty to suffer appropriately dramatic consequences. The mainstream historical fact about trial by ordeal is that it was considered a legitimate judicial procedure throughout medieval Europe, based on the belief that divine intervention would reveal truth in ways that human investigation couldn't. Hot iron, boiling water, and other painful tests were thought to provide supernatural verification of guilt or innocence, though the actual results were often more ambiguous than the theology suggested. You watch in fascinated horror as the tavern keeper is dragged forward to face medieval justice in its most spectacularly primitive form. The priest has brought his own portable brazier, apparently having come prepared for an evening of theological jurisprudence, and the iron rod is already glowing with the kind of heat that makes the air around it shimmer like liquid fire. The accused woman stares at the glowing metal with the expression of someone who's just realized that her career in illegal alcohol distribution is about to end in a way that makes plague seem like a relatively gentle alternative. Medieval criminal justice didn't believe in plea bargaining or appeals processes. Once trial by ordeal was declared, the only options were divine intervention or permanent disability. Here's a quirky historical tidbit that might provide some grim entertainment while you're watching medieval jurisprudence in action. Some accused people tried to cheat trial by ordeal by coating their hands with various substances that were supposed to provide protection against heat, including everything from holy water to sheep's urine. The success rate of these protection schemes was approximately 0, but desperation apparently made people willing to try anything. The priest begins the formal proceedings with a prayer that asks God to reveal truth through the application of controlled burning, a theological concept that would probably make modern religious authorities deeply uncomfortable, but was considered perfectly reasonable by medieval standards. The assembled crowd of illegal drinking customers watches with the kind of morbid fascination that medieval people reserved for public entertainments involving pain and potential death. The tavern keeper is given the opportunity to confess her sins before the ordeal begins, which is medieval justice's version of a plea bargain. Admit guilt and face certain punishment, or maintain innocence and face possible divine vindication or probable mutilation. She chooses to maintain her innocence, either because she's genuinely innocent or because she's calculated that burned hands are preferable to whatever punishment confession would bring. The iron rod is heated until it glows like a piece of captured sunlight, and the priest explains the rules of the ordeal with the kind of professional detachment that suggests he's conducted similar proceedings many times before. The accused must pick up the hot iron, carry it a prescribed distance, and then have her hands examined after 3 days to determine whether divine protection has prevented injury or divine justice has allowed appropriate damage. You realize that you're about to witness either a miracle or a mutilation, and you're not entirely sure which outcome would be more disturbing. Medieval theology insisted that God would protect the innocent, but medieval medicine suggested that picking up red-hot metal was going to result in severe burns regardless of spiritual purity. The conflict between faith and physics was about to be resolved through practical demonstration. The moment arrives with the kind of dramatic tension that medieval people apparently loved in their judicial entertainment. The tavern keeper reaches for the glowing iron with hands that are visibly trembling, whether from fear, cold, or the after effects of sampling her own merchandise. The assembled crowd holds its collective breath as flesh meets superheated metal in a combination that basic physics suggests will not end well. What happens next is where medieval jurisprudence gets particularly interesting, because trial by ordeal results were often open to interpretation. The woman grabs the iron, carries it the required distance, and then drops it with a scream that probably wakes up half the town. Her hands are clearly burned. You can smell the distinct aroma of seared flesh, but the question becomes whether the burns are evidence of guilt or just the predictable result of handling molten metal. Historians still argue whether trial by ordeal was a sincere attempt at divine justice or elaborate theater designed to intimidate potential criminals, but from your position watching someone's hands turn into medieval barbecue, the academic debate seems less important than the immediate question of whether you're next in line for supernatural jurisprudence. The priest examines the burns with the kind of professional attention that medieval medical practice brought to diagnostic procedures, which is to say, he squints at them, prods them with a stick, and delivers a verdict based on criteria that seem to involve equal parts theology, guesswork, and personal prejudice. The burns are declared to be evidence of divine displeasure, which means the tavern keeper is guilty of spreading plague through illegal alcohol distribution. The punishment is swift and decisive. The woman is sentenced to be bound to a wooden post in the town square and left there until either the plague takes her or she demonstrates sufficient repentance to satisfy divine justice. Medieval criminal justice was apparently designed around the principle that punishment should be both painful and educational for spectators. As the priest and his assistants drag the convicted woman away to begin her public penance, the remaining tavern customers disperse into the night with the kind of urgent efficiency that suggests everyone has suddenly remembered pressing appointments elsewhere. Medieval social gatherings tended to end abruptly when they were interrupted by judicial proceedings involving red-hot metal. You stumble out into the night air, still somewhat intoxicated, but significantly more aware of the various ways that medieval survival could be interrupted by factors beyond plague, wolves, or Mongol taxation. Trial by ordeal had just demonstrated that even seeking chemical relief from unbearable circumstances could result in judicial mutilation administered by religious authorities who were apparently convinced that God enjoyed watching people burn their hands off. You stumble through the dark streets of Novgorod with your hands still tingling from secondhand trauma, and your mind reeling from the combination of illegal vodka and medieval justice, but your educational tour of 13th century survival isn't over yet. The night air carries new sounds that make your alcohol-fogged brain struggle to process what's happening, howling from the forest, but not the familiar wolf calls you've been hearing all day. This is something different, something that sounds almost human, but with undertones that suggest the speakers have moved beyond normal human concerns, like survival, comfort, or sanity. The first thing you notice as you approach the outskirts of town is that the wooden palisade walls that were supposed to protect Novgorod from external threats have become irrelevant. The gates stand open, not because guards have abandoned their posts, but because there's no longer any clear distinction between inside and outside, safe and dangerous, civilized and wild. The siege you've been living through has evolved into something that makes traditional military concepts meaningless. Bodies are scattered around the base of the walls, not plague victims, but people who appear to have been torn apart by something with teeth and claws significantly larger than any normal forest predator. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval Russian forests contained large populations of wolves and bears, but what you're seeing suggests that the normal rules governing predator behavior have broken down along with everything else that used to make sense about the world. The howling gets closer, and you realize with growing horror that you're listening to a pack hunt in progress. But the prey sounds human, and the hunters sound like something that was human once, but has since been transformed into something that retains human intelligence while acquiring predatory instincts that normal people spend their entire lives trying to suppress. You break into a run toward the distant walls of the Kremlin, the fortified heart of Novgorod that represents the last bastion of organized authority in a world that's rapidly descending into medieval chaos. But running through a town that's being overrun by supernatural predators while still drunk on illegal vodka turns out to be significantly more challenging than normal medieval navigation, and you find yourself stumbling through streets that seem to rearrange themselves when you're not looking directly at them. Here's a quirky historical tidbit that might explain what you're experiencing. Medieval Russian folklore preserved detailed accounts of people who were transformed into wolves through supernatural means, either as punishment for crimes or as the result of encounters with forest spirits who had their own ideas about the proper relationship between humans and nature. These weren't traditional werewolves. They were people who had crossed boundaries that civilization wasn't supposed to cross. The Kremlin walls loom before you like the medieval equivalent of a lighthouse in a storm of supernatural chaos, but reaching them requires crossing open ground that's currently occupied by shapes that move with predatory coordination while making sounds that blend human speech with animal communication. You're about to attempt the most terrifying sprint of your medieval career when you notice that you're not the only person trying to reach the fortress. A steady stream of refugees is flowing toward the Kremlin from all directions, people carrying whatever possessions they could grab, families dragging children who are too young to understand why their parents are running and too smart not to be terrified by the panic in adult voices. Medieval evacuation procedures were apparently improvised on the spot by people who had never planned for circumstances that exceeded normal human imagination. The guards at the Kremlin gates are trying to maintain some kind of order while simultaneously dealing with refugees, supernatural predators, and the growing realization that their military training hadn't prepared them for enemies that combined human intelligence with animal ferocity. Medieval fortress defense was designed around human attackers who followed predictable patterns of siege warfare, not supernatural threats that could climb walls and think strategically. You join the crowd of people pushing toward the gates, but the closer you get, the more apparent it becomes that the Kremlin might be less of a refuge than a trap. The walls that are supposed to keep dangers out might also keep residents in, and if whatever is hunting through the town decides to lay siege to the fortress, you'll be trapped inside with limited food, water, and ammunition while surrounded by enemies that don't follow normal rules of engagement. Historians still argue whether medieval fortifications were effective against supernatural threats, or just created concentrated targets for entities that weren't bound by normal physical limitations, but from your position in a crowd of terrified refugees being herded through gates that might be closing behind you permanently. The academic debate seems less relevant than the immediate question of whether you're running towards safety or into a more organized form of doom. The howling is getting closer, accompanied by sounds that suggest the hunters have discovered the refugee trail and are following it with the kind of systematic efficiency that normal wolves would never demonstrate. Whatever is pursuing the fleeing townspeople has retained enough human intelligence to understand tactical concepts like cutting off escape routes and coordinating attacks, which makes them significantly more dangerous than ordinary predators. You make it through the Kremlin gates just as the first of the pursuing shapes becomes visible in the torchlight, something that moves like a wolf but has eyes that reflect intelligence rather than just predatory instinct. The guards slam the gates shut and begin the process of barricading the fortress against enemies that might be capable of opening doors, climbing walls, and thinking strategically about siege warfare. The Kremlin courtyard fills with refugees who are discovering that medieval emergency shelter involves overcrowding, inadequate sanitation, and the gradual realization that everyone is now trapped together in a confined space where plague, panic, and desperation can spread faster than wildfire. Medieval crisis management was apparently less about solving problems than about concentrating them in defensible locations. As you huddle in the courtyard with your fellow survivors, listening to supernatural howling from beyond the walls, while trying to avoid thinking about what morning might bring, you can't help but reflect that your day began with simple problems, like finding breakfast and staying warm, and has evolved into a survival scenario that combines plague, pagan rituals, medieval justice, and predators that shouldn't exist according to any reasonable understanding of natural law. The Kremlin walls might keep out normal enemies, but they can't protect you from the growing realization that medieval Russia has become a place where the normal rules of reality no longer apply, and survival depends on adapting to circumstances that exceed anything your medieval education prepared you to handle. The sounds from beyond the Kremlin walls gradually fade as dawn approaches, not because the danger has passed, but because whatever was hunting through the night has retreated to digest its prey and plan its next assault on the remnants of medieval civilization. You're huddled in the fortress courtyard with dozens of other survivors, watching the sky slowly lighten while trying to process the fact that you've somehow lived through a night that transformed ordinary medieval hardship into something that belongs in the darkest folklore, your grandmother whispered when she thought no one was listening. The morning light reveals the true extent of what's happened to Novgorod. From the Kremlin walls, you can see smoke rising from buildings throughout the town, not the normal cooking fires and hearth smoke of daily life, but the black, oily smoke of structures burning without anyone bothering to put them out. The careful order of medieval community life has collapsed completely, leaving behind a landscape that looks like it was painted by someone who specialized in depicting the end of the world. The refugees around you are beginning to stir as exhaustion gives way to the growing realization that yesterday's problems, taxes, food shortages, plague, wolves, have been replaced by circumstances that don't have names in any language spoken by reasonable people. Children are asking questions that their parents can't answer, like why the howling sounded almost like talking, and why some of the shapes moving through the streets seemed to walk on 2 legs sometimes and 4 legs other times. As the sun climbs higher, painting the devastated town in shades of gold and amber that make the destruction look almost beautiful, you find yourself thinking about the strange journey that brought you here. Less than 24 hours ago, you were a normal medieval peasant dealing with normal medieval problems. Hunger, cold, taxation, the constant threat of violence and disease that made everyday survival a victory worth celebrating. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval life was indeed harsh, often brutal, and frequently short, but it was also remarkably resilient. People adapted to circumstances that would crush modern sensibilities, found joy in simple pleasures, and built communities that endured for centuries despite facing challenges that seemed insurmountable. They created art, literature, and traditions that still inspire us today, proving that human creativity and dignity can flourish even in the darkest circumstances. But your particular medieval experience has pushed beyond the boundaries of normal historical hardship into something that belongs more to legend than to documented fact. You've witnessed the breakdown not just of social order, but of the fundamental assumptions about reality that make civilized life possible. You've seen what happens when the careful barriers between human and animal, sacred and profane, natural and supernatural, all collapse at once. Here's a gentle truth that might provide some comfort as you sit among the survivors watching smoke rise from your former home. The medieval world, for all its genuine hardships, was also a place of profound beauty, deep community bonds, and spiritual richness that modern life sometimes struggles to replicate. The people who lived through those centuries were not the desperate, ignorant savages that popular imagination sometimes portrays, but complex, intelligent human beings who created magnificent cathedrals, preserved classical knowledge, and developed technologies and social systems that laid the foundation for everything that came after. The morning breeze carries new scents across the Kremlin walls, not the smoke and decay of destruction, but the fresh, clean smell of spring returning to the Russian forests. Somewhere beyond the devastation, life continues its eternal cycle of renewal. Birds are singing, flowers are beginning to bloom, and the world is preparing to heal itself from whatever wounds have been inflicted during this long, dark night of medieval survival. As you rest against the stone walls of the fortress, feeling the sun's warmth beginning to chase away the chill of fear and exhaustion, you realize that surviving this experience, even in imagination, has taught you something valuable about human resilience, about the strength that ordinary people discover when circumstances push them beyond their normal limits, and about the way that even the darkest times eventually give way to dawn. The other survivors are beginning to speak in normal voices again, making plans for rebuilding, for searching for missing family members, for returning to the work of creating civilization from the raw materials of hope and determination. Medieval people were expert rebuilders, having learned through necessity that destruction was temporary, but the human capacity for renewal was eternal. Your own medieval adventure is drawing to a close, but the lessons you've learned about courage, community, and the complex relationship between civilization and wilderness will linger long after you return to a world where warmth comes from thermostats rather than smoky fires, where food appears in supermarkets rather than contested markets, and where the greatest predators are usually confined to screens rather than prowling through the darkness outside your windows. The sun climbs higher, painting the world in colors that speak of possibility rather than despair, and you close your eyes and let the warmth soak into your bones while you listen to the sounds of people beginning the work of building tomorrow from the rubble of yesterday. Medieval Russia, for all its hardships, was ultimately a place where people understood that survival was not about avoiding difficulty, but about facing it with courage, dignity, and the unshakable belief that dawn always follows even the longest night. Rest now, weary traveler. You've earned your place among the survivors, and your story has become part of the great human tale of endurance, adaptation, and hope that connects us across the centuries to those who came before and those who will come after. The Kremlin walls will hold until morning fully arrives, and morning always arrives, no matter how dark the night has been. Sleep comes easily now, gentle and healing, carrying you away from medieval Russia and back to your own time, your own warm bed, your own safer world, but taking with you the knowledge that you have the strength to survive whatever challenges await, because you carry within you the same human spirit that built cathedrals, preserved wisdom, and created beauty, even in the midst of circumstances that would have broken lesser creatures.